Welcome to Real Talk in ELT, a podcast that talks about the reality of teaching English. All right. So welcome back to another episode of Real Talk in ELT. I am here with Professor Michael McCarthy. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Let me give you a formal introduction for those of you who don't know Professor McCarthy. He is the Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Nottingham in the UK and teaching officer at the acronyms. Do you pronounce it or is it ADTIS?
We say ADTIS.
Okay. I never am sure because sometimes we say them or okay. ADTIS
Yes.
at Cambridge University in the UK, where he teaches EAP. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 58 books, including Touchstone, Viewpoint, The Cambridge Grammar of English, English Grammar, The Basics, From Corpus to Classroom, the Routledge Handbook of Corpus Linguistics, and titles in the English Vocabulary in Use series, which I know is quite famous here in Brazil. Lots of teachers have used it throughout their careers as students and beyond. He is the author, co-author of 120 academic papers. He was co-founder of the CanCode and CanBEC Spoken English Corporate projects, which we're going to dig into today. And he has taught in the UK, Europe, and Asia, has given talks and workshops in 46 countries, and has been involved in language teaching and applied linguistics for 57 years. Thank you so much for being here. Very excited to talk to you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, of course. So on this Sunday morning, I think it's sunny there, I would like to actually start by asking you about your research, because you focused really in language usage and corpora and discourse analysis, and I wanted to know why you decided to go in that direction. What was the catalyst for going into that area of study?
Well, really, ever since I began as an English language teacher, I've been aware of what the biggest hill, the steepest hill that learners have to climb is. And right from the beginning, I realized that the biggest single task in learning a second or foreign language is its vocabulary. To a certain extent, grammar is finite. We can corral it and boil it down to a set of principles, conventions, call them rules if you like. And the skills, the 4 skills, speaking, listening, reading, writing, are all, if you like, they are subheadings of how we use language. So I began my career by being interested in vocabulary. And this then led to a general view that I have that whatever else we do as language teachers, however else our training is sophisticated in every aspect of teaching, from the blackboard to the computer and the internet, whatever else we do, our raw material is always the language. Now, the language is obviously a massive, vast territory. So the term, the English language in itself is very vague and huge. But from the point of view that I teach, obviously, I am British, I speak British English. Therefore, I'm very keen on understanding more and more about this model, this raw material that I use in my teaching. I can't imagine any other profession where one would say you need to train in every aspect of the profession except its content. So, let's train you to be a brain surgeon, but the only thing we won't tell you about is how the brain works.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's train you to be a courtroom lawyer who can be very persuasive and can get people released from serious charges. I will teach you all the strategies you need and all the skills you need, but we're not going to teach you anything about the law itself.
I had this debate once, actually. Sorry to interrupt you. I had this debate once because someone, it was a tutor, actually, in a development course that I was doing, and they said, well, no, grammar is the most important thing. I was like, yeah, but I don't think so. I have the same viewpoint, and it was not not necessarily acceptable for me to say, no, I don't think so, because they were tutoring. But I said, if you don't have the language, then you can't apply the grammar to anything. So you have to have vocabulary first.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. It was David Wilkins many years ago, back in the 1970s, who said famously that with a lot of grammar and little vocabulary, you can't communicate much at all. But with a lot of vocabulary and just a little grammar, you can work miracles. You can survive almost in any situation. Now, that's not to say that I'm not interested in grammar. I've
No,
been
of
very
course not.
curious.
Please. Go ahead.
But, what has been the foundation for me over the many years that I've been involved in this profession with regard to grammar is that we have to understand grammar not as a static set of rules that have come from somewhere, from goodness knows where. I don't know where they came from. They were not handed down from some deity. They were not ordained by some government. They come from ourselves, from our use of language. And so for me, grammar is something that we need to look at in its context, dynamically, how it's used to support the vocabulary, not the other way around. The vocabulary doesn't support the grammar supports the vocabulary, and how we use the grammar to create various kinds of meanings and enable ourselves to interact with one another. So that's the position that I've always taken about the importance of knowledge of language for me as a language teacher.
And so then how does that, I mean, it's a quite an easy leap into getting into corpora and discourse analysis, but how did that actually go for you as an individual? Okay, so this, how did you get into it?
Well, yes, I mean, bear in mind that when I began, say, for example, the first 10 or 15 years of my teaching career, nobody had ever heard of corpora. So at that time, if we wanted to find out about vocabulary, we would either use dictionaries or reference books such as Thesaurus's, Roget's Thesaurus, I can remember using. And in terms of grammar, well, you had to look at grammar manuals and materials that had been developed for the classroom, which at that time were non-corpus based. Probably the most important juncture in my career was in the early 1980s, when I returned to the United Kingdom after teaching for a long time in Sweden. And I was very fortunate to to be accepted for a post at the University of Birmingham in the UK, where at that time, Professor John Sinclair and his colleagues were developing the COBUILD project. And the COBUILD project was revolutionary in a number of respects. Its goal was to publish a dictionary for learners. And John Sinclair, being a man of great vision, realized that all dictionaries up to that point had been based on other dictionaries. You know, if you wanted to write a dictionary, the first thing you did was you bought all the existing dictionaries and you looked at them all, and then you added a few words that weren't in them, and you know, Bob's your uncle, as we say. You have a new dictionary. Sinclair took a completely different angle, and he was developing a corpus. Now, at that time, when I first joined him and his team, he was still using computer punch cards, these funny paper cards with little holes in them where the data was stored. So everything was fairly primitive. However, the computer technology was developing very rapidly in the 1980s, and soon he was able to put together with the team this major learners dictionary, which was quite different from all other dictionaries produced for learners up to that point, a dictionary based on a big corpus. I think it was about 5 million words at the time, which at that time was considered huge, but now is considered rather small and perhaps insignificant compared with some of the corpora that we have now, which run into billions of words. But the great thing about the COBUILD project was it not only produced a dictionary, it produced changes in the way we looked at language. Not least, the message that was coming out of the computer, and don't forget, computers have no prejudices. Computers don't know what grammar is, don't know what vocabulary is, don't know what a language is. The only thing the computer does is count characters and empty spaces. And what the computer was shouting to us loud and clear was, look, language and meaning, the meanings of words can't be assessed just by looking at the word. Around the word, you will find regular patterns of grammar, chunks of lexis, frozen strings of lexis, formulaic strings of lexis. Now, this was quite revolutionary for someone like me. Up to that point, anything that was longer than one word, I thought must be either a phrasal verb or an idiom. So, colorful idioms that we all taught in our EFL classes. But what Sinclair was able to show with the COBUILD research was that the very foundation of language is this gelling together of lexical items, this freezing of vocabulary into meaningful chunks, chunks which enable us to be fluent. So if language was not chunked or clustered in that way, then there is no way we could ever produce automatic, fluent speaking or writing. So that was one major insight. And the other major insight was that it was apparent that it was the lexis that was driving the grammar, not the other way around. So when I began as a language teacher, grammar was like a series of slots into which you popped lexical items. You dropped words into these slots: subject, verb, object, adverb, preposition, noun, and you simply dropped in the vocabulary. What the corpus showed us was that it was the other way around, that the vocabulary pre-existed in these formulaic or frozen chunks with which we interact fluently and automatically. And when we observe those chunks, sure, we can see patterns. We can see the prepositions are always followed by nouns or informs or pronouns. They're not followed by, normally, they're not complemented by adjectives. So sure, we could see patterns, which you can call it grammar if you like, or you can just call it patterns. I prefer to call it the conventions of the syntax of the language. But that was a major, major transformation for me as a young teacher. And that was in the early 1980s. And from then on, computer technology advanced at a rapid pace. So that within 10 years, we were all using ordinary desktop and laptop computers, as opposed to huge mainframe computers the size of a domestic freezer. And
took up a whole room.
Yes,
the old
exactly,
ones, yes.
Yes. The computer room, yes, where there was no room for anything else except the computer.
Right.
So yes, so the technology made rapid advances, and the main result of that was it enabled non-computational specialists like myself to begin to explore corpora. We could do it on our own desktop computers in our workplace or at home. And that changed everything. That meant that in my own case, as someone who had for many years been producing his own materials for classrooms, I had always enjoyed that process of finding texts and creating exercises for my students. To be able now to access a corpus and to base my materials on real evidence of usage, I think was a big transformation for me. So that's how I got into it. It was both being there at the right time as the technology was progressing, but also working with a genius upon whose shoulders I've always stood, John Sinclair, who taught me to look at language in a completely new and different way. And then the coincidence of the technology and the language insights enabled me to produce materials which I felt more confident about, that they were representing the raw material in a more reliable way. That's a very long-winded answer.
No, I loved it. I loved hearing the history of it. It makes a lot of sense. And I think, if you look back into the 80s and 90s and kind of think about how things were changing and how people, the perspectives and concepts and theories and methodologies that were all kind of coming out at that point, it's interesting to see how there was a kind of a culmination of a lot of different things coming together. Great thinkers and technology and all of these things came together to create these scenarios where we evolved a little bit in our perspective. I'm going to kind of diverge a little bit from my questions, because now I'm wondering, how do you feel about this new technology? Because you were there at the beginning of the technology analyzing corpora. So how do you think, or how do you feel, I should say, about these new technologies like AI that are very much trained on corpora and reproducing, well, I'm going to put this in quotations, human-like text. And so, because you came almost from the genesis of looking and training until now and what we're seeing coming out now.
Well, I'm very fortunate being based at the University of Cambridge here, that I'm close friends and associates with the ALTA team. And ALTA means Automated Language Testing and Assessment. But don't be fooled by the emphasis on testing and assessment here. But one of the things that this brilliant team of young researchers is doing is developing a chatbot for learners of English. So in other words, it's the classic AI technology. The machine is trained, as you rightly say, using data. It doesn't necessarily have to be learner data, but it could be native user data, and it could be a combination of learner data. And once the machine is trained, as it were, it gets upon its own 2 feet, and in theory at least, should need no further training. Now, I've seen examples of how this might work with learners, and there are several things that I think we have to say about it. Firstly, outside of English language teaching and learning, interaction with this kind of machine has become commonplace anyway, in the form of smart speakers at home. Smart speakers respond to commands. They also respond to requests for information. So the population in general is becoming, slowly but surely, more accustomed to the idea that you interact with your environment through your voice and through mediated by some kind of artificially intelligent machine. Now, if you transfer that to the English language learning context, then sure, it's not beyond the current technology, and this is what is happening in the Alta Research Unit. It is not beyond the current technology to simulate a conversation. And by a conversation, I mean you and the bot exchange sentences, utterances, and what you get back from the machine apparently makes sense. So the machine might say something like, hey, have you traveled much outside your own country? And the student might say, yes, I've been to the United States. Now, once the machine has that, it can then say, oh, which part? Did you go to the East Coast or the West Coast? So it can simulate a conversation. Now, there are pros and cons to this. There are upsides and downsides. The upside is that as long as the learner, the student, is aware that they're conversing with a machine, then it provides a wonderful practice context. And there's nothing new in this. Recall, back in the 1960s and 70s, we had language laboratories where you could sit in private without a teacher standing over your shoulder, and you could practice for hours on end, answering questions, repeating things. It was a private environment which was non-threatening and which enabled you to practice, repeat, learn from the feedback. In the case of the language laboratory, you just heard a repetition of what you were supposed to have said, and you can hear whether you said it right or wrong, pronounced it correctly.
There's actually a few franchises here in Brazil that still have some of this is integrated into their program. So it's not something that is completely gone away, but I think they're now integrating new technology where it is a safe environment for students to be able to interact with technology and kind of reduce that anxiety, right?
It reduces the anxiety. It also, now this is the next important upside of it. If it is adaptive, and by adaptive, I mean that the machine learns about your level from the input, or you might even be able to simply say, look, I'm a B2 student, or I'm a C1 student, or I'm a B1 student. And the machine will immediately adapt its vocabulary and syntax to your level, probably with a bit more. The classic example of I+1, the input that you already know, plus a little bit more that you're going to learn from. So, I mean, that technology is fairly straightforward. And the adaptive level of it, that is, the machine adapts its output to match your input in terms of level and so on, is, of course, a major, major step forward compared with the traditional language laboratory.
Do you think some of these things need to be revisited then? Sorry to interrupt. Do you think some of these things need to be revisited then? Because these are things that, language laboratories, it was things days old, in the past. But now we have technology that might be able to create a more dynamic environment, the adaptive technology like you're talking about.
Well, my hair is grey enough to show you that I've been around for a long time. And one of the things that slightly depresses me about our profession now and again is the way we tend to reinvent the wheel. There's not a lot that is new under the sun, as we all know. And, paradigm shifts are rarely completely new leaps into the dark. And so I think, yes, my response would be, I'm sure there are things to learn by looking back at language labs and the methods that they incorporated. The notion of drilling, for instance, which is a terribly unfashionable notion now. Maybe with the new technology, with the chatbot, drilling could become more dynamic. It could be more adaptive and less tedious and boring. So there are, of course, upsides, and not least going back to the environment in which the student can chat with the chatbot. It's a safe environment. We all know what the dangers are on the internet of chatting with anyone who we've never met, and especially if for young people who are perhaps vulnerable, the chatbot provides a completely secure and safe environment. And so that's another upside. Now, of course, the downsides are that it is a machine. And if we compare it with the human teacher or the classroom peer, then what's missing in the case of the human teacher is that all good teachers, and I'm sure you're one, Kelly, have a very simple way of working. And that is, yes, we go into the classroom with a plan, a lesson plan. We might have a set of slides. We might, have a particular video we want to show them or a text we want them to read. But by goodness, I would absolutely bet that your lesson plan falls to pieces at the first golden moment of what we call a learning opportunity. So we respond moment by moment.
Throw it out the window.
Yes, throw the plan out of the window, respond to some golden opportunity to take the lesson into a new direction. And this comes from the fact that language teaching, in my experience, good language teaching, has three participants. Think of it as a triangle, and that triangle has at one of its points the teaching material, the content, the subject matter, the raw material, if you like. But mostly for us, it means materials published by publishers. That's one point on the triangle. Another point on the triangle is the learners, our students. The third point on the triangle is the teacher, us. Now, the whole process is an interaction between those 3 points, and it's not teacher to material to student. Yes, of course that happens, but it's also student to material to teacher, and it's teacher to student. So there is this constant buzzing of what I call the interaction triangle, which responds to the moment. It is emergent in that true meaning of the word emergent. That is, that you cannot predict and should not predict how it's going to, the direction it's going to take and the goal it's going to achieve. And this is the best, this is the most wonderful thing about language teaching. If language teaching were only a question of following a lesson plan, then we could have had robots doing that years ago. And that's where the current technology of the bot is weak. That's where I'm fairly confident that it won't yet entirely replace the human teacher. So that's one of the downsides. And the other, not necessarily a downside, but something that teachers are also good at, is motivating students, giving them good reasons to want to come back next week or to do the homework or to take a particular exam. And motivation is a very delicate psychological concept, and we know quite a lot about it. We know that it is not linear. It's not that you're either motivated or not. The work of my great late colleague at Nottingham University, Zoltan Dernier, shows that motivation itself can be a longitudinal process that develops, that can be nurtured, that has, if you like, occasional surges and then may drop back a little bit. And human teachers are very good at responding to that and seeing ways around that. I'm not sure that the machine has yet developed that. But overall, I see no problem with technology intervening in language teaching. After all, we've been using technology for hundreds of years. Printing, the invention of printed books was a technology. We tend to forget that. Books are a technology. And then the advent of things like broadcasting, films, radio, TV, they are technologies. And we have always used these technologies in language teaching and seen both their value and their disadvantages. So yes, books are wonderful, but if you want to get your class speaking, reading, getting them to read out loud is not quite the same as getting them to have a conversation, a proper conversation. So yeah, technology will always be with us. I'm quite impressed by the work of people like Gavin Dudney and his colleague Hockley in what they call mobile learning, where you harness the fact that all your students are going to have phones, or you hope that you're lucky enough to be in a part of the world where everyone has a phone, and that you use this tool, this thing that they have in their hands as a learning technology. So when I started as a language teacher, my pockets were full of a diary. I had wristwatch on my wrist. If I wanted to take photographs, I had a camera around my neck. I had this clutter of objects which enabled me to go through daily life. Now all I need is a smartphone. And all those other things are combined: the diary, the timepiece, the camera, the video, the internet. It's all there on this little thing. So Dewdney and Hockley have advocated that we see this object, this smartphone, not just as a technology to be used outside in the world for communicating with your friends or finding out the bus timetables online, but that it is actually something that can give you a new learning experience, just as printed books must have come like a bolt of lightning in the 16th century onwards. That they're not just new objects; they actually give you new ways of learning, and that's what I think we need to look at all the time for any new technology, whether it's a chatbot, whether it's the internet itself, whether it's the smartphone, whether it's the domestic smart speaker, anything like that can be harnessed, can be exploited to provide new learning experiences, new pathways towards learning.
And it might create more work for you too, because here's why. I did when I was doing my Delta, the program, I had one of my teaching points I decided to do on writing and computer mediated communication. And so I decided to do a discourse, kind of a basic discourse analysis of computer mediated communication, because now while we use these as new tools, I was like, well, this is kind of changing the dynamic. This is something completely different because we haven't had this before. So then people like you who go into corpora and study and analyze and really dive into that are going to have the opportunity to look at whole new sets of data. This is a completely new thing. It's uncharted territories, and people are using it, and it's day-to-day communication. It's changing the dynamics of communication too. So it is providing, while it's providing a good tool for us, it is also providing an opportunity for more research, because now it's changing again. We thought we had a handle on it before, and and the game has changed. So
yes, I mean, as I say, it's a salutary thing to consider technology not just as something electronic that happens with the internet and so on, and machines, that it's always been there. We've always found ways of using new technologies. Mm-hmm. So, as I say, the obvious thing with the printing press was that for the very first time, you could have textbooks. You could have everybody in the class reading the same book. Now think how revolutionary that was. If you only had manuscripts, then probably it was the teacher who had control of the manuscript and may have let you have a look at it or whatever. But printing enabled everyone in the class to be using the same material. And we take that for granted. But it's only been something for granted in the last, 400 years or so. Dictionaries, again, the idea that every household in the country could potentially have the same dictionary. The effect of that on the standardization of the language is absolutely massive. And it goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this chat. Where do these rules and lexicons come from? They're not handed down from the sky by some deity. They're not ordained by some government. We are fortunate that they are recorded in print and now electronically online by archivists and people who have been able to do it thanks to the technologies of printing and publishing and so on. So corpus linguists are sort of a new kind of archivist in a way. We try to grasp large aspects of the language, whether it be spoken English or business English or academic English. We try to store it, but we always have to bear in mind the fact that it's, as you said, it's constantly changing. And those changes are not just, oh, this particular bunch of data was recorded 5 years ago, this particular bunch of data was recorded now. What we have to be aware of is the very modes of communication are changing, as you say. So the blurring of the border between speech and writing has been huge in the last 20 years, you know. Emails, when they started, resembled letters. Dear Professor McCarthy, I'm writing to you, blah, 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 blah. Yours sincerely. That's how emails were in the early 90s. Now, they're more like speech. You know, it's, hi, Mike, how's it going?
Right.
When will you have that chapter ready for me? Best of luck, signed up. So even though it's typed into a keyboard, and apparently it's writing, it's of course far more speaking. And instant messaging is the same example. It's sometimes very difficult to look at a chain of instant messages and to actually decide whether you're looking at the transcript of a conversation or something that has taken place through the phone, and which, unlike face-to-face conversation, can have a gap between the so-called speaking turns. The gap could be an hour, but it doesn't matter because the dialogue is intact. The chain of utterances remains coherent, we hope, and intact. Whereas in face-to-face conversation, you have this terrible pressure to reply within a second, just over a second at the most. And if you take any longer to respond, there's trouble. You know, so typically if you're speaking on the phone and you don't say anything for more than a second, the other person will say, are you still there?
Right. It's an interesting new dynamic. When I was writing my paper on and kind of researching superficially, it was interesting to see the correlation, and I tried to kind of put those two, like, here's speaking, here's writing, and here's this new thing that's happening. It's very, you know, I couldn't even put it into terms. Sometimes I had difficulty kind of structuring it to say, you know, it has components from both, but it's not easily identifiable for one category or another. And these things are turning very fluid now because of the changes.
Yeah. So instant messaging combines the synchronicity of face-to-face conversation with the asynchronicity of letters or emails. You know, if someone sends you a text message, there's no legal obligation to reply to it straight away. You put it in your pocket and have a think about it and reply later. But the resultant chain of communication looks just like a conversation. So yes, these technologies are not only technical affordances, they actually create new modes of communication. And as language teachers, we have to be aware that new modes of communication can mean, if we use it adroitly, can mean new learning experiences.
I'm gonna kind of change the topics because I do want to ask you about this. As I work with mostly business English, I did want to kind of go into the grammar for business and the Canbec that you worked on, and maybe, I don't know if you ever afterwards, if you studied the Enron emails because those are now public domain, and looked at those as in a terms as a corpora. But so what was, I guess I could say, what was the related to business context? Did you find any differences when you started looking at general, well, we're going to put this in quotations, this is very big generalization, but general English and then business English? And did you find any interesting distinctions between looking at, you know, the discourse and the corpus there?
Yes, numerous differences. And I was very fortunate at the time also to be working with a brilliant researcher, my students, Michael Handford, and Handford's book on business, spoken business English, I think remains unchallenged as a classic. But working with Michael and my own research, we looked at ways in which spoken interaction both reflected conversational principles. So, to a certain extent, spoken business English is just like any other kind of spoken English, face-to-face conversation. But at the same time, because it is business English, or because it is academic English, it develops certain ways of communicating. Now, the big thing that distinguishes spoken business conversations from chats with your friends is that business English is goal-oriented. It has goals, and it has to get to those goals as quickly and efficiently as possible. If you compare that with a casual chat with your friends, mostly you don't go into the coffee shop, sit down and say, hi, John, today we're going to need to discuss your new hairstyle, my car, and that documentary that was on TV last night about
Well, you might have a friend like that.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be very fun, but that exists.
These are people of whom we say they talked at me rather than with me. So one fundamental distinction that we find in things like business English and academic English is that they are goal-oriented. They are usually time-limited. So you have this pressure of time, this pressure of the fact you need to achieve a goal. And this is reflected in the language. So classically, if we look at something like business negotiations, trying to work towards deals, and you want to make a deal, you're not just there to chat and drink coffee, then there are certain ways of using the language that will help you to get quicker to that goal than others. And a couple of examples that I looked at personally and have published on, and I'll go back on them now and say why they were important. One was the use of vague language expressions.
Oh, good. I was going to ask you about the 2019 article. I did want you to comment on that.
Okay. And the other was the use of the word no, N-O. So it is, to a certain extent, I was quite surprised at the prevalence of vagueness in business discourse, and the same in academic discourse, incidentally. That, we tend to think as outside naive observers that everything's got to be very precise, so here's the deal, this is the manufacturing process, this is the timeline for delivery, this is the price, these are the facts kind of thing. It's not like that at all. People are constantly feeling one another out, probing one another. And of course, one of the most important aspects of this probing is the extent to which you can rest on shared knowledge. So if you don't have to spell everything out, if you can assume that a great deal of knowledge is shared, then you will get faster and more effectively to your goal. So you will often find in the business context that people will not list all the products that they want to sell. They will just list one or two of them and then say, and products like that, or and processes like that, or and timelines like that. And that vagueness is a really important part of projecting to the other party that I don't need to spell out in tedious and boring detail, which is going to take up the whole meeting. I don't need to spell out all these factors because this is a shared world. You are business people, we are business people. You are students, university students, we are university teachers. We share these worlds. So shared worlds is a very, very big thing in the business discourse. The ability to project assumptions which enable you to get very rapidly to your goal. Now, another aspect of the vagueness is that, of course, you will never do a business deal if you dictate terms and have no mobility, no room for maneuver, no wriggle room, so to speak. So the vague language also enables you to give the other side a chance to negotiate and to modify. So, I might say to you, Kelly, I can do you a great deal on shampoo, toothpaste, soap, and things like that. And you are then at liberty to come back to me and say, well, okay, but does that include conditioner, hair conditioner?
Yeah, it's almost a form of probing where you're allowing the other person to engage, but also customize exactly what they want. So you're kind of probing them with the vague language.
Yeah. Because the point, the fundamental point, and this is the discourse point, if you like, the fundamental point is that categories are never fixed. You might say, okay, pharmaceuticals, yeah, shampoo, conditioner, soap, whatever. In fact, the categories always have vague, fuzzy edges. And in communication, we can take advantage of those vague and fuzzy edges precisely to negotiate. And of course, at the heart of business discourse is the notion of negotiation, especially if you're looking at negotiating deals and working with other companies, or even working within a company with your immediate colleagues. So that whole notion of projecting assumptions, shortcuts to understandings, but leaving that little bit of room for the other party to engage and to find a middle ground is really fundamental. Now, on the other hand, I looked with a co-author, Elena Mayuga from a university in Moscow, Russia. We looked at the use of no, NO, the negating response. And we looked at it in the British English spoken data and in a Russian corpus of spoken business Russian. And we found commonalities, and we also found some differences. So the commonalities are that no is a very hard, very powerful word to use in business negotiations. And I don't know Russian, but I can certainly tell you that in the English data, it's far more likely to be prefaced by another word which softens it and modifies it. Things like, well, no, or actually, no, rather than just saying no. However, we did find that there was a slight cultural difference, that Russian is more, if you like, tolerant, more accommodating of a straight no. And I found that to be a rather interesting finding, in so much as it could possibly create misunderstandings or, if you like, slightly militate against a good relationship. Because the reason we say, well, no, or actually no, or no, not really, rather than just saying no, is because there are always two strands to business English, just as there are two strands to conversation of any kind, whether it be academic, business, or general. One strand is the content, the information strand. You're transmitting something. You're talking about your new hairstyle or your car. You're talking about pharmaceuticals or heavy lifting gear in engineering firms. Or in the academic context, you're talking about mathematics or medicine. That's, if you like, the content strand. But no interaction can purely proceed on the content strand unless it's a robot. It's the machine at the airport just saying, flight X2487 will now depart from gate 49 and not the gate previously announced. And if you say, oh, heck, then the loudspeaker doesn't say, sorry about that. So very rarely do we have that robotic communication. In real face-to-face communication, whether it be conversation, business English, or academic English, we have this interactive strand. And if you don't work hard on the interactive strand, you will not make a deal with your business partner. You will not put new knowledge over to your students and get them to interact in seminars or webinars or whatever the context is. So in the business world, you have this interactive strand. No was one example. Another example I always quote is the extraordinary frequency of the verb need and the extraordinary frequency of the collocation between need and the pronoun we. So one of the most common two-word chunks in the whole of spoken business English is we need to. And when you look at the actual examples of usage of this, very often it means you must. So if a superior says, imagine, Kelly, that you are working in a business and your superior says, Kelly, we need to get this document to Eric in Stockholm by 5 p.m. You're not likely to reply, oh, do we? Oh, that's interesting. Because you will almost certainly interpret it as saying,
you need to do that. There's no escaping.
You are likely to say, okay, I'll get on to that. Leave it with me. Yeah. So why don't we say, Kelly, you must get this to Stockholm. Kelly, send this to Stockholm at once. Because, of course, the best way to get your business colleagues, your work colleagues, workplace colleagues to do anything is to have a good relationship with them. And then they will do anything for you. They will bend over backwards for you to help you. So we have that strand of interactivity in business English, and we also find it in academic English. So you have these two layers, the content, the information, the goal orientation towards getting that deal or getting over knowledge about a particular academic concept. Underneath that, you have this layer of interactivity. Now, if we go back to the content layer, we also find extraordinary differences in patterns of language use, and especially in the kinds of chunks that we find. So if we look at business English, another example that I often use in talking about the research into spoken business English is the fact that the two-word chunk going forward is very common in business English, going forward. If you look at the two-word chunk going forward in a general spoken English corpus, you'll find it has a variety of meanings. It can mean, driving a car forward instead of in reverse. We have examples of that in our corpus. Lovely story of someone who thought they were reversing in their car when they actually had it in a forward gear and smashed into a house. So that was one type of going forward. Another type of going forward is we have tennis players talking about feeling that they weren't going forward, not making progress. Yeah. In the business corpus, going forward almost always means from here on into the future, here on. So going forward, we'll blah, 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 blah. And that's what it means. Now, this is a case of what I call pragmatic specialization of chunks of language. And you get the same pragmatic specialization in academic English. So any compartmentalized English represents a community of practice, whether it be business or the academic world. Could be other worlds like teacher education worlds or vocational worlds and so on. Any community of practice develops its own pragmatic specialisms. And these become kind of frozen formulae which have meanings within that context. They develop meanings for that context. And this, for me, has been one of the biggest eye-openers about understanding things like business English or academic English.
I just like listening to it. It just makes so much sense. And I think that looking at this data and being able to extract those types of things is brilliant, because one of the things that I think what happens is teachers sometimes, especially in teacher training, they get this idea, well, you have to work on people dictate to teachers a lot, you have to work on this and intercultural communication, and you need to be able to have communicative competence. And sometimes it's not tangible in people's minds, right? And so when you're talking about this line of content, but then also this interactivity, this is what we mean by communicative competence. This is what we mean by intercultural training. This is almost like a tangible example of it. See, if we only use this, the message is not going to be able to get across. We're not able to communicate with other people. So it's interesting that we actually have to go to the data to be able to understand these concepts, because we
Yeah,
hear it
and
constantly, but it's
yes,
not
and I think the reason why
practical.
the data is the reason why we have to go to the data is that the computer doesn't have any prejudices. It doesn't have any ready-made judgments about language. All the computer says is, look, here are the things which are extraordinarily frequent or extraordinarily infrequent, if you like. So in the business discourse, the verb must, that verb of obligation, is actually extremely low frequency, because it's supplemented, it's made up instead by the use of the word need, which has quite a different kind of interactive effect. So yeah, that's why we go to the data, because neither we nor the reference books, the archives, the printed archives, are sufficiently aware of what we're doing. We need this kind of objective machine to say, look, like it or hate it, this is what you do. When you negotiate in business English, or when you're giving seminars in academic English, this is what you do. These are the chunks you use. And, you know, particular chunks in business English or academic English maybe and often are tens, 20s, almost hundreds of times more frequent than they are in, say, general social conversation outside of those contexts. And it's interesting that you should say this business of teacher training and focusing on communicative competence and intercultural awareness. I and my colleague, Stephen Walsh, who I've been researching with recently, Stephen works at the University of Newcastle in the UK. We've been looking at what we call the fifth skill. So we've got speaking, reading, listening, writing. This fifth skill is the interactive layer that enables the movement towards your communicative goals. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look up fifth skill in the literature, or if you Google it, you'll find that some people think it means just that, intercultural competence. Others see the fifth skill as being translation. So in either case, the fifth skill is considered as something you do because your interlocutors are of a different culture or a different language. Actually, what Steve Walsh and I say is, no, the fifth skill is there whether you're speaking a foreign language or your own language. It's actually the most fundamentally human thing to do. You know, we don't deliver monologues. We can do, but it's very rare that one would deliver a soliloquy. You know, only Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, ever did that. So right now, I consider I'm having a conversation with you. Okay, I'm hogging the conversational turn. That's because you've invited me as a guest to do that. But I hope I'm constantly aware of the fact that I can preach my message about language and language teaching, but that at the same time, you and I are interacting, moving towards a goal, which might be, I don't know, 5 minutes from now or whatever. So there are always those two layers, and we call that the fifth skill, the interactive layer. And that fifth skill applies as much to social conversation, it applies as much to academic teaching, and it applies to you and me as a language teacher in the class. You know, we're always doing two things. Go back to that triangle, if you like. There's the material. There's me, the teacher, teaching it. There's the student there learning it. There's the fifth skill, where teacher and learner are moment by moment exploring the learning opportunities.
I like, it's an interesting concept, and I think that I actually very much believe that in terms of interactivity, and we need to have this skill to do it, but it's hard to quantify, qualify it, right? And it's hard. So as of right now, we know, oh, well, reading and listening have sub skills, and these are the sub skills that, and this is how we do this, and we've procedurized a lot of things. But interactivity, how can you make it into a procedure? How can you give oh, well, here's a sub skill of being able to do that, right? So the other skills, we have sub skills, we know how to more or less, we have some indication on how to train them in our classes, but interactivity is, like you said, it's uniquely human. It's
Yeah, we can classify is probably the wrong word. We can get a handle on it.
okay.
So, for example, my co-author Michael McCarthy has written about this, and I've co-authored articles with her, that if you look at any conversation, you'll find there are usually 3 or 4 things going on in the interactive layer that are constantly being come back to. One is conversational management, the ability to open and close conversations. Another one is the ability to adjust your message for your listener, to you doing this all the time. A third one might be what we call good listenership. That is the ability to respond, to acknowledge, to show the other person that you've actually listened and understood and either empathize, agree or disagree or whatever. So we know what these interactive skills are, but to put them into practice in teaching procedures and teaching materials requires corpus evidence, and it requires obviously syllabus building like any other kind of material construction, but it crucially requires a training in noticing and language awareness, because basically it's very difficult to teach how to be empathetic to your interlocutor.
If you figure that out, you're going to make millions. How to be a human.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. But there are things we can get a handle on. So responsiveness, for example, how people respond is there in the corpus. You simply look for the beginning of speakers' turns, and you find they are heavily patterned.
Okay.
Regardless of what they're talking about, when someone opens their mouth to speak, there are patterns, very heavily patterned, what we call turn openings. And those turn openings are a real portal, a window into what we call good listenership. They show at the beginning of your turn, regardless of what you want to say, how you start your turn always reflects what you've just heard and how you're reacting to it. Work pioneered by Hong-Yin Tao, who at the time was working at Cornell University in New York State, and who I think at present is in California, University of Southern California. So work has been done in these areas, and we've tried.
Maybe it just hasn't filtered out to the general population. Like the studies have been done.
Well, we tried to do it in our touchstone and viewpoint materials, which have met with success. But I think it's probably still not quite at the heart of teacher education. I think we're still hooked on some of the things that you've mentioned, this notion of communicativeness and intercultural awareness and so on. Yes, intercultural awareness is just a bigger picture of what you might call interhuman awareness. Yes, we speak different languages. Yes, we have different histories and different cultures. But at the end of the day, we are all human beings and not, some other kind
learning
of
to interact with people and making sure that the accommodation theories and things like that. I know that these exist. It's just how prevalent is it in teacher awareness when we're.
I don't know, but probably a work in progress.
So that brings me to my last question, because I don't want to take too much of your time, but I'm really enjoying just hearing your perspective on these things. So discourse analysis and looking into corpora and things like that can be quite intimidating for some teachers if they're not passionate about it and going into the field. So how could you say for people teachers to even get a superficial understanding of it so that they can start interacting with this types of research and data to bring it into their classrooms? What would be...
Right. Well, I would say, as with a lot of things in language teaching, there are two ways of approaching. There's the top down and there's the bottom up. And I think it's the top down that's intimidating. You know, people think, oh, good heavens, discourse analysis is this yet another layer of teaching that I'm going to have to incorporate into my lesson plan. Oh, good heavens, I already want to do a bit on grammar and pronunciation. I want to teach them new vocabulary. That's what's intimidating. If you take it from the other end and look at it from a bottom-up process, then you say, yes, I am going to teach grammar. I'm going to teach the grammar of speaking, and I'm going to look at available materials for the grammar of speaking. And my grammar lesson is going to be more about what Diane Larson-Freeman calls grammaring. That is not just that learning of static rules, but actually putting grammar into action or putting it into action. So you're not going to abandon the grammar lesson. You're going to give it what I call a discourse dimension. After all, discourse analysis is simply the study of language in its contexts of use. That's all it is. It's examining language in its context of use. And this includes grammar in its context of use and vocabulary in its context of use. So in a way, it's not magic. It's not rocket science. It's simple examples. So one of the examples I give in my, well, a long time ago, my 1998 book was, you know, if you're teaching the reporting function, speech reporting, yes, of course, you want to get your learners to practice saying, Mary said she is going to get a new job, or John told me he's just passed his examinations. Okay, that's what we classically do. If you look at a corpus, you find equally commonly people say, Mary was telling me she's going to get a new job. John was telling me he's not going to do his exams. Now, what's the difference? You've suddenly gone into the progressive, continuous form of the verb. Well, these correlate with, hey, I've got some news to tell you. I'm not just reporting what someone says. This is a discourse function. It's saying to your interlocutor, hey, listen, I got something really interesting to tell you. Mary was telling me she's going to move house. John was saying that he's not going to do the exams this year. This is a discourse dimension to grammar. It's not just this is the past tense and one of them is simple and the other is continuous. It's this is the past tense. One of them is a dry report. The other is a, hey, I've got news for you report. It's interactive. And there are so many examples of that in grammar. Just the past progressive in itself. There's a huge difference between a student saying to a professor, I want to ask you a question. I wanted to ask you a question. And I was wanting to ask you a question. I wonder if you can help me. I wondered if you could help me. I was wondering if you could help me. Very different in the relationship they create. So it's simple things like that. That's what discourse teaching is. It's not some mysterious world where you have to completely rethink everything you do. All you have to do is look at the grammar and look at how you use it yourself, how we use it. And that's what's important. That's what's exciting. That's what makes things interesting.
I think that's an easy way for people to baby step their way into it. Look at a single lesson. What are you trying to do there? And just see.
Exactly. Yes.
It doesn't have to be a huge study and spending all of your waking hours. But start small.
Perish the thought. Perish the thought that we should find yet another layer of complexity and responsibility for teachers. We've got enough on our hands with having to suddenly overnight teach everything on video platforms and
it's too much. But Can start small, look at something and have a realistic view of it and see what.
Well, that's what I did myself. And, obviously I had the experience of many years. And the wonderful thing is you never stop learning these things. So, it's been a long journey for me, becoming aware of different ways of looking at language and different ways of teaching it. And now I only teach part-time, but it's still one of the most rewarding, wonderful things I do in my life.
Well, you've certainly taught me a lot. I've actually thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation with you. And I want to thank you. If you have any last nuggets of wisdom, please feel free to share.
Well, I think I'll share one, which I think originally I derived from my own great mentor, John Sinclair, and that is always question orthodoxy and fashion. Never sit back and say, oh, this is the latest thing I have to do in language teaching. Always challenge and question orthodoxy.
I love it. Well, I'm going to link all of your website and to your books and articles. I'm going to link it in the show notes so that if people are interested and want to check out any of your writings, your literature, then hopefully they do, because it's been very helpful and eye-opening for me. So I do want to thank you so much for taking the time out and sitting with me today.
Well, thank you, Kelly, for inviting me, and thanks for being such a friendly host and making me feel relaxed and comfortable.
Oh yes, this is Real Talk in ELT, just a friendly conversation between colleagues. Well, thank you again.
Indeed.
Until next time.
Goodbye to everyone who's watching this, and I wish you all the best in your teaching. Goodbye.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk in ELT. Want to join the conversation? Head on over to Instagram at Kelly Pennington ELT and send me a message. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube or Spotify channel to stay up to date, and of course, take care of yourself, your health, your vibe, and your tribe. Until next time.